Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the Dawes Act, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. Today we're going to look at the way the US government treated Native Americans at the end of the period of Western expansion after the year 1870. You've already learned about Indian removal and the Trail of Tears, which happened in the 1830s. Those things happened a lot earlier than what we're going to learn about today. There are major differences in how the US government dealt with Native Americans in this earlier period before 1870 and in the later period after 1870. All right, let's start by reviewing treatment of Native Americans in the first part of Western expansion before 1870. In the early 1800s, white Americans began settling and establishing cotton plantations in the Southeast, including states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And as the white settlers moved into these lands, they came into conflict with Native American tribes in the region, including the Cherokee. It was the conflict with these tribes that led Andrew Jackson to sign the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Native American tribes were forced to leave their homelands and move to Indian territory, resulting in the Trail of Tears. And by 1840, most Native Americans had been forcibly removed from the southeastern states, as well as some states in the Midwest, as you can see on this map. The goal of the Indian Removal Act was to separate Native Americans from white people, to create a separate place for Native Americans to live, that was Indian territory, where the idea was they could continue to practice their culture apart from white people. You might remember Andrew Jackson's speech to the Cherokee in which he said, "Circumstances render it impossible that you can flourish in the midst of a civilized community." So Jackson was saying that whites and Indians couldn't live together, they had to live apart. We might refer to the government's policies towards Native Americans during this period as separation. As Western expansion continued, white settlers moved into new lands like the Great Plains and came into conflict with other Native American tribes like the Sioux and the Comanche. These tribes were also forced onto reservations, although not in Indian territory. Instead, new reservations were created in the West. And on this map, you can see some of the reservations that the US government created in the later part of the 1800s for Native Americans who lived in the West. So, while these Native American tribes weren't forced to go to Oklahoma as the Cherokee had been, they were forced to go to reservations in other places. Again, the government's policy here was one of separation. Whites took land and made Native Americans live on reservations separate from them. So that's the earlier part of westward expansion. But then, starting around 1870, the government's policy changed. And this change was exemplified by a law called the Dawes Act, which was passed in 1887. The Dawes Act, instead of forcing Native Americans to live separately from whites, instead forced them to assimilate into white culture. Assimilation is the process of adopting a new culture. So instead of separating Native Americans from whites, the goal of the Dawes Act was to get Native Americans to be like white people and live alongside them. Assimilation is not a bad thing. I know that some of you are immigrants from other countries who have assimilated into American culture. The problem with the Dawes Act is that assimilation was forced. It forced assimilation on people who didn't want to assimilate. Here's how it worked. One goal of the Dawes Act was to encourage Native Americans to follow capitalism and embrace the idea of private property, which was foreign to Native American culture. According to the Dawes Act, Indian reservations would be broken up into different plots of land, each plot owned by individual Native Americans. The owners were then free to sell these plots of land. This sounded good on paper. Native Americans were getting to control their own property. But since many of them were desperately poor, they sold their land to white people at low prices. Take a look at this picture. It's an advertisement offering Indian land to white buyers. As a result of the Dawes Act, white people ended up owning a lot of the land that had previously been controlled by different Native American tribes. And between 1887, when the law was passed, and 1934, about 50 years later, Native Americans lost control of 100 million acres of land, which was 2/3 of all the land they had held before the law was passed. Another aspect of assimilation was the creation of what were called Indian boarding schools. The most famous Indian boarding school is the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. That's what you see in this picture. The US government took Native American children away from their families and had them live at these boarding schools where they learned how to be like white Americans. There were some big problems with these schools. For one, they contributed to the destruction of Native American culture because the children who lived at them had to give up their heritage and adopt the culture of white Americans. They learned to speak English, they wore American clothing, and they learned to practice Christianity. Another problem was that Native American children who resisted doing these things and tried to continue practicing their own culture were beaten and abused. Indian boarding schools published a lot of before and after pictures showing the so-called progress that Native Americans had made in assimilating. As you can see, the children have given up their old clothing and adopted the clothing of white people. In the eyes of the US government and most white Americans, this change was a good thing. But for Native Americans, the loss of their culture was traumatic and was just one more indignity that they faced at the hands of the US. Before we finish, let's recap what we learned. In the first part of Western expansion, the US policy towards Native Americans was aimed at separating them from whites. But in the later part of westward expansion, starting around 1870, the policy changed, with the government encouraging Native Americans to assimilate into American society. One way that this was achieved was through the Dawes Act, which allowed Native Americans to own and sell their land, and which promoted Indian boarding schools where Native American children learned how to act like white people. The result was the loss of land and destruction of Native American culture. All right, time to review the objectives. Look these over, and if you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.